All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Brady, and I'm here to affirm the resolution for today, which is here to talk about the potential for the Occupy movement to do something good and to be sufficient to actually uphold sort of the material conditions of black people in this nation. So first, I want to start off, I guess, with like a brief sort of like historical analysis of how the Occupy movement has come into existence and what this really means for black people going forward. So I guess the first thing that happened, sort of beyond the sort of like the moment of the Arab Spring, things are happening sort of like Egypt, Yemen, is that in May 30th, 2011, the Spanish Indignance movement, which is basically like this really large scale occupation movement that happened in Spain, called for a worldwide revolution, like a worldwide occupation of all economic subcenters across the globe. This sort of like movement then sort of went out to sort of listservs, Facebook, and Twitter, and sort of became was sort of galvanized around a Canadian group. Well, sort of called like the Adbusters magazine, but this is a sort of like an anti-consumerist magazine, right? And what they did is they sent out to their listserv this call to occupy specific places in North America that they thought were central to the global economy. One of these, of course, being Wall Street, right? So in September 17th, after sort of numerous discussions between people and activists in New York, buswaying through Canada, Ontario, et cetera, et cetera. September 17, 2011 was the first sort of action that occurred to occupy Wall Street. It was about 100 to 200 people deep. It was a march through Wall Street, through New York, and then they camped out. A couple. I think it was about like 20 to 30 people like camped out the first specific day, living in cardboard boxes. This of course grew into hundreds and hundreds of people that began to occupy that daily. Of course, as we know now, the Occupy movement itself is so much bigger, I guess, than Occupy Wall Street. It's come to encapsulate not only just numerous cities in America, including pretty much every major city, including Baltimore, Maryland, over McKeldin Park, but also is a globalized movement. Every single quote-unquote first world country has an Occupy movement, including, and also many different other countries, including many South American countries and many Asian countries, also have an Occupy movement that has sort of galvanized support within those nations. I think to me what this means, and I guess what we want to discuss here, is what does Occupy really mean? What does it mean to occupy a space? And what does this sort of ideology really mean in a larger political discussion, specifically for black people? I guess the largest part that people know about the Occupy Wall Street movement is that there seems to be no specific demands that are coming from people. There seems to be no specific articulations to a political state or a political agent for any specific group. But we do know one thing is that they sort of have this ethical demand, which is that society itself as we know it is fundamentally unequal. There is a top 1% that has pretty much the majority of the wealth in this nation and receiving the majority of benefits from the government, including tax cuts, et cetera, corporations being represented as people and gaining rights to actually affect politics through elections. And then there's this sort of bottom 99% that is being sort of like completely oppressed by the 1%. What this ideology, I guess, in terms of its openness is sort of encapsulating for me is that as an ideology, it's calling not only just for the sort of like freedom from oppression from the top 1%, but also it's calling for a multicultural and sort of diverse articulation of interests. Well, this means that the 99% as we know it is not just like some sort of huge conglomerate of people, but are a series of different groups with different specific interests that are being represented. By sort of this larger articulation of Occupy. So I guess what this means that the sort of like myth of the Occupy movement of why it doesn't have specific demands is, well, specifically I guess a myth because it's sort of specific local situations and local articulations, there are sort of these localized demands that happen, right? So the things we know about, for instance, in Baltimore, right, is that specifically in this space, they go to like specific banks, they call for like an actual Occupy sort of like fundamental pullout of those banks in order to sort of use that as a form of protest, right, to get those specific banks to actually like sort of talk to the people and sort of change their banking policies. Right. Well, this means that on the low, even though there's no sort of articulable sort of like national sort of like movement, there is a localized sort of demand. Also, what this means is that there is this sort of larger effect that it's having nationally on the type of conversations that we're having. Right. So since like the 1980s, since sort of the Republicans took over the government in the 1970s and 1980s, what sort of happened is a sort of like neoliberal discussion. What this means is that generally the government discusses tax cuts for the wealthy, tax cuts for corporations being good for business, and then sort of trickle down economics where it's like if we give to the top 1%, eventually that will trickle down in the form of jobs and the rest for the people. And I guess I stand ready for cross-examination. I don't know if I put enough time on the clock, but we'll go for it. We'll go for cross-ex.
Okay. So my first question is, you talked about, one of the last things you finished out on was talking about the context of like the 80s and neoliberalism.
Yeah.
What exactly do you think that, I guess, the rise of focusing on neoliberalism does when it comes to thinking about organizing social movements?
Well, I think what it means is that it's about, to me, like changing sort of the political discussions that we're having, right? So, like, in general, the type of political discussions that we were having pretty much since the 1980s going to the 1990s, even with Bill Clinton, was really about saying we need to free up businesses. We need to free up the control that taxes put on business so that eventually they can create more jobs for people. What we've sort of understood since the 80s and the 90s is that, well, no, when you actually create tax cuts for the wealthy, when you create tax cuts for businesses, they only put that money in their own pockets. They don't create jobs for anybody. As a matter of fact, what we've really seen is a grand deduction of jobs that are available not only to Americans, but also globally speaking, in terms of a globalized unemployment rate.
So my next question is about, I guess, this bottom 99%.
Yeah.
You talk about this ideology of openness that includes a bunch of different voices. My thing is, how exactly does that inclusion of multiple voices deal with, I guess, structural antagonisms that might exist between the 99% of people?
You mean like the structural antagonisms that are happening within the 99%?
Yes.
Okay, I think what happens to me is that in terms of like an activist sort of like orientation on the ground is that, yeah, I mean, there's going to be some difficulties, right? Like specifically, what we know about the Occupy Wall Street movement, right, is that it's mostly populated by like a very like large, somewhat privileged group of people that generally aren't concerned, as we know it, with sort of like material conditions that are affecting black people. What this means to me is that on the ground, right, is that we have to create these sort of discussions, because in my opinion, if you're just waiting for basically white people to not be racist against black people, you're going to be waiting a long time for that one, right? In general, what this means is that on the ground, we have to articulate a politics and begin to create open discussions with people and actually like argue against them and change their minds in that way.